I've always wondered how much self-criticism is too much self-criticism. On the face of it, it seems like there couldn't be too much self-criticism, right? I was raised in a culture where self-criticism was one of the highest values. And not only criticizing yourself as an individual, but criticizing your social identity as well. So criticizing your culture. Criticizing your culture was something that we were taught at school from small on. I mean, you got good grades not when you could name a lot of facts and could repeat the facts that you were told by the teachers, but you got good grades when you had good points countering those facts. So, very differently, the very same teachers that were teaching us, on the other hand, they had to learn by heart every single Kaiser of Austrian history. This is not something that was ever required from us, but we had to be able to think critically and criticize every single idea we were ourselves exposed to, at the very same time as being able to criticize every single idea that we ourselves put out there into the world. So, what we were required to do is to ask the question, how would other people respond to your ideas? What will other people think about your ideas? So, don't just present the position, but think about how that position will be incorporated by other people as well, how it will face friction in the world. This seems to be different from the way my parents, for example, were educated. And within my worldview and within my cultural context, this was one of the highest goals. It was one of the best things you could do. But the question is, how much of that is too much? Because you can certainly overdo it. And what I've started seeing in the course of time is that very much like in the real world, a lot of what actually is workable and what's not workable depends on who surrounds you, what context you find yourself in. I think the same is true of this form of self-criticism and bracketing yourself and re-examining yourself and your own history from a critical standpoint. One of the first impressions I had of this was since I moved to Austria from Eastern Europe, I of course had a very positive notion of Austria and Western Europe in general. I mean, we wouldn't have gone there if we hadn't had a positive notion of Western Europe. People don't leave their home only for better economic opportunities. This will be actually very offensive to tell to people that the only reason they go somewhere else is financial, right? People choose to leave their home oftentimes because they're not very happy with their own culture and with the way things are done in their own culture. This is a significant factor. Many people have to fight against very negative emotions and very negative experiences that come with leaving your home. This is not something trivial. Leaving your home and leaving your cultural identity behind is not something that's just easily doable, particularly not the prior generations who have been raised on the notion of homeland. I mean, I have not ever really encountered this idea during my education. The notion of homeland was something that's foreign and old. So I don't think I would suffer that much if I was to change place again now. But for my parents' generation, it was very different. They were strongly raised on the idea of home, of physical belongingness and physical home, and being part of a we space that's very unique to the historical place you have been born. And respectively, it was very difficult to leave those places. And yet people left because they felt that somewhere else, culture offered more to them. The way people relate to each other was more promising of, well, normal human relationships. And it's something I don't hear very often, but I think it's a very, very normal reality for many people who leave their homes, that they're simply not happy with their culture. They don't always run from just war and just economic circumstances. They oftentimes run from culture itself. And having run with my family from a culture, I moved to another one. Of course, I had a more positive picture of that Western culture I was to be socialized into. But what I could not understand is why the Western culture itself I went to was more self-critical of itself and more relativizing its own achievements than would actually, to me, seem appropriate. What seemed to me appropriate is that certain things were decently well settled in the West. Like, it might seem trivial, but for me it was not trivial, that all you had to do is basically do your homework, literally do your homework at school, and you could be sure that you could have a decently normal life, which means you could be sure that you could feed a family and that no one will take your property away, that you could have an education, you wouldn't have to fight for your place at university to study, you wouldn't have to have the right uncle who knows the right person so that you can study what you really want to study. So all the basic factors that make up life, to me it seemed were pretty decently well in order. And I therefore thought, well, a culture that has achieved that, an achievement it is, because if there was no achievement in that, then what's the point of culture? Then you could just stay an individual. But I think that's the point of culture, of making sure that as a community, we can meet the expectations of most of us and give the opportunity to most of us, if not all of us, to develop within the specific realm of development that it's possible to us as an individual. So as long as you do your homework, take this now metaphorically and literally, I felt the world I was introduced to was pretty fair and pretty decently structured to give you all the opportunities that you need to make it. And I still couldn't understand why people in this very culture, which I was introduced to, didn't really see value in that. At least on the surface of it, it didn't feel like they celebrated that achievement and that they in any form ritualized its reality and emphasized that it's something that's not just God-given, it's not just something that's everywhere anyway, but it's something that has been a cultural achievement of past generations. They had to do something for it. And I was a bit surprised that this was not praised, that the achievements of past generations were not praised. And just simply objectively stated, hey, that's what we did well, and on these fronts we're not doing so well, which will always be the case. What I found instead was a hyper self-critical, well, it couldn't be worse attitude. As if things have never been worse in the past, as if other cultures are not doing worse. And I couldn't make sense of that because I had definitely the feeling that I was coming from a culture which in many regards was not doing so well, obviously not, and even by objective measures, not doing so well. And the irony here was that, however, my origin culture had a stronger self-identity and a stronger positive self-image than the culture I was introduced to. You know, it's like you being introduced to someone who is clearly doing better than you in many regards, and that person at the same time having much more self-doubts than you do. And you're like, dude, what the fuck? I mean, stop playing around and just admit what you can do well, and stop fooling everybody else, and stop trying to get everybody else's love by self discriminating against yourself. It's almost like a manipulative technique where you make yourself smaller so as if to deserve more by others. That was really weird to me. That didn't make sense. And the question that I find still interesting is, how much of that is actually workable? Because self-criticism itself is not unhealthy, I believe, even regarding your own culture, and you can always try to do things better. But when does it become obsessive? Or, well, when does it become harmful? And it seems to me it very much depends on your environment. So the other entities surrounding you. In the case of a nation, the other entities surrounding you are your bordering countries. So if they all play along with the game of being self-critical and focusing on doing things better than they did in the past, and never really praising achievements, I think you can play the game pretty long, and you will have a mutual understanding. You will have basically a shared world space. You would have a shared set of values with those surrounding countries. You would not be competing with each other. You would be basically playing the same game. And then it can work. As long as everybody plays this game, you can out-compete each other for how much of a bad guy you are, and how self-reflective you are, and how much insight you have into your evilness, and overdo other people by being more evil than they are, and by being more self-critical than they are. Then you can play the game. But this game stops being productive for you the moment the other side does not play by that game, or doesn't play by the same rules. The moment you have a different society which does not accept as a norm the value of self-criticism, looking at your own history and looking at it from only a skeptical perspective, the moment you have somebody who doesn't play by those rules, you are at a competitive disadvantage. Same thing on an individual level. When you're playing the game of self-criticizing and self-annihilation, I'm not sure it really has a clear-cut physical boundary where you just, once you transgress it, you dissolve and you have no identity anymore. Because it, after all, provides you with an identity, provides you with a sense of who you are. Well, I'm the critic. I'm the one who is constantly self-criticizing. And as long as you have a self-identity, you won't just self-dissolve. But the reality of it is, the moment you have an enemy who is not playing by the same rules, you will have a very difficult time competing with that enemy. Because what works within the first environment, where everybody else sees this as a value, self-criticism as something that is valued, as something that provides you with status in a society, as long as you play the game within that frame, everything's fine. But as soon as you start playing against someone who doesn't give a damn about self-criticism, doesn't give a damn about fairness, about universal values, then you are in trouble. Because everything that made you strong in the first context now makes you weak in the new context. And I feel this is what limits self-criticism on the level of nations and on the level of individuals. When you change, this is what happened to me, your social context, from a social context where self-criticism is valued to a context where it's not valued, you either adapt or you die. That's basically your alternatives, because you won't make it in the new context. Your values simply mean nothing to your environment and are actually a disadvantage in the new environment. You won't be able to take a position. You won't be able to express your voice. You won't be able to express your own interests by always wrapping them up into some form of self-criticism and self-relativization. Quite the opposite, actually. You will be taken as someone who doesn't know who they are, as someone who is just strange, just not really following the way things are done in this new context, and you will lose out in a competitive setting. And the same thing goes with cultures. When you have neighboring cultures which don't share your obsession with self-criticism and beating your own heroes into oblivion, you will have a difficult time competing with those cultures, simply because their social identity will be stronger, it will be much more coherent, and much more determined than yours. They will be much more willing to fight for their ideals. They will be much more willing to even die for their ideals than you are, as someone who, well, whose most central ideals are focused around criticism and criticism of your own past. You just won't have the arrows to go somewhere and insist on whatever it is that you stand for. And this is, I believe, the reality of it. This is when you've gone too far, if you can't compete anymore in your new environment. And oftentimes it seems people have gone far too far, and this is only possible when they have never shifted their environment, when they have always stayed in an environment where this kind of tactics gives them an advantage for acquiring status. And you never find the measure of what's the right measure of, on the one hand, being proud of your past, being proud of your culture, being proud of your parents and the generations that came before you, and the suffering that they went through, and all the sacrifice that they had to put up with. And on the other hand, changing many aspects of society that obviously need to be changed. I don't think we can just by ourselves strike the balance, thinking ourselves into it, right? By just sitting in our armchairs and asking the question, what's the right amount of self-criticism and what's the right amount of pride? I think the way we find the balance is by going out there and seeing, well, how does our self-identity, how does our cultural identity compete with others around us, by actually engaging with them and by actually engaging with people who are significantly different from us. And my experience has been that the moment people start shifting, stop avoiding each other, because avoiding is so easy nowadays. You can just spend your entire life at home, never having talked to a single person you don't like, because we are so physically independent from each other. It's so easy to be physically independent from other people. And in the past, the major thing that brought together people who were different was their physical dependence on each other. They depended on their physical well-being on each other. And whether they liked it or not, they had to kind of stick together and stick around each other to make it. And we saw it as a big sign of liberation, that you could finally leave these annoying neighbors, family members that you had to stick with in the past, and choose your own path. But the reality of it is that what we usually choose is not diversity, particularly not diversity of values. What we usually choose is sticking around with the same people who share the same value horizon as we do, who never really challenge us on that, and who don't point out to us, they can't, because they're coming from the same value horizon as we do, when we have overdone something to a degree that we become incapable of being competitive in other social contexts. And what I have seen happening then is that people basically literally become incapable of living and surviving unless they are in their own social group. Everything from how they use language, to what they pay attention to what movies they consume, to how they think about themselves and the world, becomes incompatible with a slightly different social context. And even if they have to shift even slightly, to them it's like death. It's literally like death. When you have to change your social sphere from hanging out with academics to hanging out with truck drivers, you will have a very difficult time. And when that's the reality we live in, we don't live in one society anymore. We live in multiple societies, we live in multiple cultures that can't really communicate with each other, and yet on the global level, they compete with each other. And the competition is becoming much more real today, when many countries have decided that they don't accept national boundaries anymore. And the moment this happens, the fighting will become it will become very real from just being metaphorical today. from being cultural fights, it will become very physical, actually. And if you're not prepared for that, well, you're simply gone. You're gone as a social entity, as a social unit. Many social units have fallen apart. You don't know anything about them anymore. They're long gone. And this is what usually happens when a culture is too isolated from an actual competitive environment. It is very similar to what might be happening on the individual level with us as physical and biological beings when we are separated from a competitive environment. And I've been raised on the idea that competition is bad and that what we want to create is a perfect society of fairness, where competition is not a relevant factor. But the reality of it is that competition is real, whether you like it or not. And if you can't compete, well, you're gone. Nobody will care.